I want to thank all the conference organizers for taking an interest in my research. Thank you to Elaine for chairing this panel, and thank you to my fellow panelists as well, Edith, Ann, and Jennifer, for their wonderful presentations, which I was able to watch in advance. This conference is a gathering of such formidable scholars and curators, and I'll admit I'm pretty nervous to present today, so hopefully everyone will allow me some grace. To begin, I would like to acknowledge my position as a white settler woman living in Toronto, Ontario, in part because my research and analysis are concerned with how settler material culture has impacted the political and environmental landscapes in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River Valley region. Many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories upon which I live and work. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. I recognize the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and this territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So the subject of my presentation is this signed and dated quilt in the collection of the Canadian Museum of History, made by Mary Morris in Ireland 4 years before she and her family relocated to the South Crosby township of Upper Canada's Leeds County in 1829. This quilt is a patchwork of printed cottons surrounding panels of white cotton embroidered with representations of flowers, birds, and bugs, as well as 2 hunting scenes. It strikes me that this object feels a bit out of place within this conference and its focus on modernity, which invites a focus on the 20th century. But with my analysis of this quilt, I hope to show that settler women in 19th century Canada were agents of modernity insofar as their home crafts contributed to the visual and material culture of empire that sought to establish the Western ideals of capitalism and industry in Canada and other colonial territories. I regard Morris's quilt as representation of the systems of trade and industrial production that bolstered British global power in the early 19th century. The apparent influence of Indian chintz textiles on Morris's embroideries and her use of English cotton fabrics in her patchwork undermine the relative importance that has been assigned to romantic settler colonial narratives in homespun cloth in early Canadian material culture, thereby challenging the notion that early Canadian rural domesticity and the women that managed this domain existed outside the bounds of modernity and politics. Morris's quilt shows that worldly tastes and manufactured goods were transplanted to the domestic interiors of Upper Canada by British women who contextualized themselves within the global British Empire and valued access to an international modern economy. Significantly, Morris's quilt design and embroideries derive in large part from the Indian chintz fabrics that British consumers have historically associated with global trade and wealth. Chintz here refers specifically to cotton fabrics made in India for the European market starting in the 17th century that were painted or printed with vegetal designs using mordant and resistant dyes. Many of the flowers that Morris embroidered onto her quilt reference specific flowers that appear in chintz fabrics. And here you'll see a side-by-side comparison. On the left-hand side is an Indian palampour from the 1700s. And on the right-hand side of your screen, a detail of Morris's quilt. And I've circled particularly this rose hip motif that is common between the 2 examples. And here's another comparison of the same objects. And I've circled what looks like a lily flower motif that is also very similar in the 2 examples. The East India Company that made Indian chintz available to British consumers was a corporate interest that installed colonial rule in India by way of a trade monopoly. As a result, so-called Oriental wares, including Indian chintz, were assigned great value in 18th century British culture because they both internationalized domestic interiors and defined the home in relation to the British Empire. By the 19th century, the British notion of home was synonymous with imperial products and imperial power. Though she may not have recognized it herself, Morris's embroideries signify her interest in global systems of production, trade, and exploitation. And in the Canadian context, her quilt would have been treasured as a sign of her and her family's position within the British culture and its global systems of power. The popularity of Indian chintz textiles incentivized British and European manufacturers to appropriate Indian craftsmanship and develop the means to produce comparable products domestically. And English cotton manufacturers thus began producing industrially printed cottons in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. I date many of the cotton pieces in Morris's concentric squares of patchwork on her quilt to the second decade of the 19th century, when English cotton manufacturers were still sourcing their raw material from American producers that relied on the slave trade. These very fabrics were held as examples of Britain's new industrial capabilities, further establishing its competence as a global power. By the early 20th century, Indian nationalists protested the obliteration of India's textile industry by the rise of British manufacturing and its effects on worldwide tastes, and sought to recover India's textile traditions from their attachment to British colonial interests. This material history is arguably made visible by Morris's quilt, which contains both Indian chintz imagery and examples of early printed English cottons. In Canada, the prevalence of printed cottons may be in part attributable to the fact that British settlers and business interests traded these materials to purchase access to North America's natural resources and land from Indigenous peoples. For example, cloth figured in land cession agreements and became one of the most popular commodities at Hudson's Bay Company trading posts as early as the 1740s. Like the East India Company, the HBC was established by British Royal Charter in the 17th century. The possibility that printed English cottons eventually accounted for an amount of the cloth exchanged at his trading posts is presented by Isaac Weld, who observed in the late 18th century that Indigenous men in Upper Canada often dressed in shirts made from, quote, coarse figured cotton or calico of some gaudy pattern, not unlike what would be used for windows or bed curtains, end quote. The combination of exotic imagery and industrial materials in Morris's quilt and the correspondence of these design elements to imperial economies is significant. Historian Douglas McCullough has argued that the history of textiles in colonial Canada is underdeveloped precisely because trade and industry narratives have been largely ignored or moderated in order to preserve the romantic notion that, quote, country people did not buy fabrics at all, end quote. This homespun myth dates to the Confederation era, and McCullough duly cites a speech delivered in 1865 by Adams George Archibald, a leading lawyer and politician in the Maritimes, wherein he lauds, quote, the great body of settlers in the country whose backs are covered with woolens of their own production and who sleep between the blankets of their own wool and their own weaving on feathers from their own farmyards, end quote. Historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich has shown that there is also an American myth of homespun dating to the 1760s, when the Revolutionary Whigs advocated for the substitution of English and European fashions with crude American alternatives. In both Canada and the United States, then, the decidedly anti-modern homespun myth has been essential to the formation of national identity. In keeping with homespun mythology, the history of quilt making in Canada has long been presented as an uncomplicated narrative celebrating resourceful, resilient, and practical settler women living without modern conveniences and harboring few worldly desires. There are two significant historical surveys on Canadian quilts. Both emphasize the scarcity of materials and self-sufficiency of early Canadian quilt makers. In 300 Years of Canada's Quilts, Mary Conroy illustrates the difficulty that settler women had sourcing ready-made materials for quilt making and blankets in Upper and Lower Canada before the mid to late 19th century. She recounts their reliance on flax, which was used to produce linen, an insufficiently warm material. In Quilts and Other Bed Coverings in the Canadian Tradition, Ruth McKendry likewise asserts that cotton and other finished materials were largely unavailable for purchase in many settler communities until the mid-19th century. According to McKendry, many of the first quilts in Upper Canada were patchwork quilts made from worn-out clothing. Morris's quilt is pictured in McKendry's text, and she once owned this quilt herself. But Morris's quilt discords with the provincial history of quilt making presented by both McKendry and Conroy, not least because it was not even made in Canada. Morris's quilt was a memento carried to Canada's backwoods from Ireland, and its combination of Indian chintz motifs and English printed cottons is aspirational in a way, representing the British tastes and economies that settlers hoped would displace Indigenous customs and authority. Indeed, the dish with one spoon wampum belt covenant was instituted by the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee First Nations in 1701 precisely because the foreign marketplace had disrupted their environmental and political relationships, and later land cession agreements would further disorder Indigenous relations. Therefore, while Morris's quilt may seem decorative and benign, my analysis shows that its motifs and materials ought to be understood in relation to a material culture that sought to undermine the sustainability of indigeneity. As a result, we can at least question the quilt narratives produced in the 1970s when there was a desire to distance settler women and rural domesticity from modernity and politics. Thank you so much.